Welcome to the Great Basin Fire Potential Outlook for May through August 2017. This is Gina McGuire. Over the next few minutes, we'll talk about the recent weather and drought conditions across the Great Basin, along with the current state of our fuels, El Nino and La Nina, and the expected changes to weather and fire potential over the next few months. First, looking at this last 30-day period, in April, temperatures were generally near to just below normal over the northern half of the Great Basin and near to above normal over southern areas. Precipitation has still remained largely above normal in the Sierra and over the northern half of the Great Basin and has now trended to below normal or even well below normal into parts of southern Nevada, the Arizona Strip, and eastern Utah. Now if we look at the pattern from December through this past March, you can see the very wet conditions over much of the Great Basin in December and especially January, where all areas of the Great Basin saw very wet conditions. However, as we moved through February and March, some areas of the Great Basin, especially the southern half, started to dry out, with still wet conditions further north. That was in February. If we look at March as a whole, you can see generally dry conditions across much of the Great Basin, with the exceptions of parts of eastern Nevada into the northern half of Utah and the central Idaho mountains. However, we did see a fairly dry period in most areas throughout March. Now, if we go back to the beginning of the water year, October 1st of last year, you can see well above normal precipitation over the Sierra into western and northern Nevada and across Idaho, Wyoming, and the northern half of Utah. Even over the southern half of the Great Basin, even though precipitation was less over the last 6 months, we still saw near to above normal precipitation in all areas. Now if we look at this a little bit differently, we did see historic amounts of precipitation. This is showing the precipitation percentile across the West for the period of record from 1895 through 2010. And as you can see, these areas of dark green over the Sierra into western and northern Nevada and into Idaho, Wyoming, and the northern third of Utah, this was, in some areas, the record wettest conditions we've seen. Areas further south were closer to normal, but again still saw very healthy amounts of precipitation. Now if we look at the drought monitor and outlook, all the precipitation we've seen over the last year or two has now eliminated drought conditions across the Great Basin and really much of the West, with the exception of the far south. Also, looking at the next few months, through the end of July, we're not expecting any drought conditions to return to the Great Basin. Now what about the state of our fuels? Obviously, we've had quite a bit of precipitation across the area, so we're still in green up in many areas. However, looking at the 100-hour fuel moisture in the areas of the Great Basin over the south into the Arizona Strip, southern Utah, and southern Nevada, we are seeing 100-hour fuel moistures that are below 10%. But again, we will gradually see these fuels cure across the Great Basin from south to north as we go through the next month or two. Now, if we look at the state of La Nina and El Nino, we'll see how that will affect our weather as we go through the summer. Now we will look at the sea surface temperature anomaly animation across the equatorial Pacific to show us what's happening with El Nino and La Nina. We were in a state of La Nina last year, and we've been gradually transitioning to this neutral state where temperatures are right around normal. So as you can see, this area right off the South American coast, the colors are hovering between white and some light shades of orange, which shows that we're kind of in that normal range or neutral range, so not in La Nina or in El Nino. And we will look at how this will change as we go through the coming months. So now we've seen where we are with respect to El Nino and La Nina and that we are in a neutral state. This bar graph will show us how we will change or what our expectations are over the next several months. The high bar graph for the green shows that there's a high probability above 80% that we would be in a neutral period early through the spring, which is where we are. However, as we go through the rest of the spring and towards the summer, that probability of neutrality starts to decrease, so we'll likely be seeing a return of El Nino, which is the red bars on the graph, and you can see we creep up above the 50th percentile as far as probability as we move towards later in the summer into the fall. So we will likely see these neutral conditions continue through much of the fire season, with some transition potentially to El Nino as we go into later in the year. And how this will affect weather across the Great Basin: generally, if we do stay in this neutral period, we will see periods of very hot, dry weather, but also a return of periods of thunderstorms and windy conditions off and on as we go through the summer. Now, after we already talked about what's been going on and what we expect to happen, what are we expecting for temperature and precipitation as we go through the fire season? This graph right here, and we're mainly focusing on the lower half of the page, showing the temperature and precipitation over the next 4 months. Temperature is the top or the middle row of the map, and precipitation is the bottom row. As we can see, as we go through May, we're expecting temperatures to finally start heating up across the Great Basin, with potentially some very hot temperatures in southern areas. This will rapidly dry the fuels out, especially in the southern areas of the Great Basin that have been seeing some drying over the last month or two. However, as we go into June, we may see some cooler weather return to parts of southern areas of the Great Basin, and then again, warmer or above normal temperatures possibly in July and August on that western and northern side of the Great Basin. As far as precipitation, we'll finally see a return of maybe drier weather, especially over southern areas throughout May, and then by June and July we may see that drier weather push into western and northern areas. As the monsoon starts to become more active towards July, we will see those wetter conditions return to southern and eastern areas of the Great Basin. But right now it's pretty uncertain how far west that moisture will make it, so we're still looking at somewhat drier conditions on western and far northern areas. Also, at least on the eastern half of the Great Basin into Wyoming and eastern Idaho, the monsoon moisture may be pushing pretty far north. However, we will talk about this as we get into later outlooks and closer to the start of the monsoon season. Now we'll put all these pieces together, and here is our official outlook for the Great Basin. We will still continue to see below normal fire potential in the higher elevations at least through June as we wait for those warmer, drier temperatures to start melting some of that record snowpack that we've seen in some areas. So it will take some time before those high elevations really come into play. However, at mid and lower elevations, once the fuels really start drying out as we go into later in May and especially June, we may see a return of above normal fire potential to parts of western and northern Nevada. As again, we've seen a lot of winter precipitation, so we will likely see a significant grass crop in some of these areas. As these fuels finally dry out and we see a return more of lightning as we get into later in the summer, this potential of above normal fire activity is likely, at least on the western side of the Great Basin. As we move later in the outlook period, we may see that area extend somewhat further east into parts of Idaho or Idaho or Utah. However, right now that eastward extension is a little bit uncertain with the monsoon moisture, so we will be keeping an eye on that. That concludes our monthly and seasonal briefing for this month. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Thank you for listening.